You're listening to the Strategic Foresight for Asia podcast. We break down the geostrategic forces shaping Pakistan and the region, delivering foresight and bringing expert analysis and practitioner insights on the trends and choices defining our future.
Hello, welcome to StrafAsia's podcast. Today we will be focusing on Afghanistan issue, especially in the context of recent contact between Pakistan and Afghanistan facilitated by China. This is the first diplomatic contact after Ghazb-ul-Haq was launched in February 26. And I have with me Dr. Amina Khan, who is an authority on Afghanistan issue. So welcome, Dr. Amina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start from the more recent development, the peace talks, or you can say the consultations that happened between Pakistan and Afghanistan facilitated by China. So what's the role of China and how did these talks turn out?
Well, first of all, China has always played a very instrumental role in bridging Pakistan and Afghanistan towards one another. And we've seen this in the past as well. So I don't think this came about as a surprise. It was expected. However, the current timing, I think, is important to keep in mind because, as you know, there has been a complete lull in ties between Pakistan and Afghanistan, particularly since October, where we have seen, I would say, close to a complete destabilization in ties, where there has been very little interaction between the two, and we've seen military skirmishes and whatnot taking place between both the countries. So this, I want to just clarify, was more, I think, of a meeting or an icebreaker than actual negotiations, because I think we still have a long way to go in terms of negotiations. What we saw in Turkey and what the Qataris facilitated was more negotiations. This was more of a meeting between both sides, I think, to touch base and to see whether progress can be made and whether these can lead to then actual negotiations. Because you see, we've had a number of negotiations, but the problem is that the sticking point is still there, where Pakistan continues to expect the Afghan Taliban to adhere to the pledges of reform that they, themselves agreed to in Doha. And sadly, we are seeing, you can term it as unwillingness or the inability of the Afghan Taliban to, adhere to those requests that Pakistan keeps on asking them in terms of the TTP. So I think this is an important issue for the Chinese as well, because, the ATIM issue again is propping up. And the Chinese have also made, I think, this point very clear that while the Afghan Taliban in the past may have taken steps against the ETIM, they're not willing to hand over ETIM members to China. And I think that is also causing immense concern for China. And hence we see China's efforts in trying to bring both these countries together to move forwards. Because I think it's important to highlight here that the ETIM is a major threat for China, but so is the TTP. Let us not forget that most of the attacks that have taken place on Chinese installations or individuals have all been orchestrated by the TTP.
Great, thank you. Since you are Director CAMEA, that stands for Central Asia, Middle East and Afghanistan at the Institute of Strategic Studies.
No, it's the Center for Afghanistan, Middle East and Africa.
Sorry, it's the other way. So I should have introduced you earlier. You also focus on Middle Eastern issue. So in the context of ongoing war, US-Israel war against Iran, and the regional developments, how significant it is to build these bridges with Afghanistan at this moment?
I mean, certainly, Pakistan can't afford to have vulnerability on its Western front. We already have had it because of the situation with Afghanistan. But I think this adds immense pressure, particularly coming from the crisis in the Gulf. So I think it's of immense importance that at least some semblance of stability is achieved, at least with Afghanistan. I know it's a bumpy ride, it's difficult, it's a sensitive issue because daily we are, getting our soldiers martyred on the borders. But again, I feel that dialogue is the only way to move forwards, because we've seen kinetic operations do not achieve the desired results. We've seen this. There are civilian casualties on that side, then we have immense, casualties on this side. Even just on the second day of, in fact, the meeting that was taking place in Urumqi, we had this devastating attack in Banu. So, I feel that a middle path has to be found. But here I have to say that the onus is on the Afghan Taliban. Because you see, the demand that Pakistan is making is not something out of the blue, it's not unprecedented. It is simply holding the Afghan Taliban accountable to those pledges of reform and those promises that they themselves agreed to in Doha, which was that no terrorist entity will be allowed to use its soil against, a neighboring country. And we have seen that, unfortunately, the TTP since August 2021, even before that, but particularly after their return, has been using Afghan soil against Pakistan. So while dialogue, of course, is the only way forward, I think the Afghan Taliban also have to move beyond dialogue and show some practical steps, which unfortunately we haven't seen them take. It's just been verbal commitments, sadly.
They have given these kind of verbal commitments number of times during Doha process as well to third parties. Do you think they do not have the capacity, or there's lack of political will amongst the Taliban factions? Because number of times they have assured, given these kind of assurances, but then we see these attacks happening. And they also say that since TTP is attacking targets or harming Pakistan, so it's Pakistan's responsibility. So in a way, they want to pass this back to Pakistan, that it's not our responsibility. So is it an issue of capacity or lack of will on the Taliban side?
I actually feel that the Afghan Taliban have adopted a compartmentalized approach when it comes to counterterrorism. We've seen the Afghan Taliban taking action against the ISKP. We've seen the Afghan Taliban taking action against even the ETIM. It's only, unfortunately, in the case of the TTP where we clearly see both. I think it's a combination of lack of will and somewhat inability, but I feel here that it is more lack of, they're unwilling to take action against the TTP because they have certain limitations. And while Pakistan does understand that, taking action against the TTP might come at a price, but, I think the Afghan Taliban need to make a decision. What is more important for them, appeasing a terrorist entity for short-term gains, or would they, or do they really want to jeopardize a relationship that they've had for so long with Pakistan? Because look, the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan is not just about the relationship between Islamabad and, say, the Afghan Taliban. It's about two countries. It's about two people. And the kind of interdependence that these two countries have, I think it's unprecedented. So I feel that the Afghan Taliban need to make a choice. If they want to be accepted as a responsible member of the international community, they have to adhere to this particular issue, which is not supporting the TTP. And while I understand that there is concern that if the Afghan Taliban takes action against the TTP might turn against them and join the ISKP, this is valid. But again, this is a decision that the Afghan Taliban need to take, because look, at the end of it, it is costing them immensely, because it's jeopardized their relationship with Pakistan. The border has been closed since October. There is no engagement between both the countries economically. Both countries are suffering. So I think there's more at play here. And sadly, the Afghan Taliban do not seem to see this. And let me just add here, while the Afghan Taliban conveniently say that it's a Pakistani problem, certainly it is a Pakistani problem. But at the same time, the Afghan Taliban conveniently forget that they were the ones that were able to broker a peace deal, temporary ceasefire, between Pakistan and the TTP, which lasted for about 5 months. This was in June 2022, and then in November 2022, the ceasefire, obviously, it collapsed, but they were able to bring it about. Also, the Afghan Taliban, time and again, they offered to relocate the TTP to, say, Badakhshan or other provinces. So if there is no leverage, if there is no presence of the TTP in Afghanistan, then how come the Afghan Taliban have offered to do these things? So conveniently, to say that it's a Pakistani problem, it's just convenient, and they're just brushing, I think, their responsibility under the carpet.
No, true. Very well explained. So if you talk about that they might be doing it for short-term gains, so one is that they are worried about that these factions might join ISKP. So that could be one reason. But again, difficult to comprehend, because in the longer term, they have to look at the strategic level. How important is the influence of outside actors in influencing Taliban's policy on terrorism. So once we talk about outside actors, definitely Pakistan alleged that India has been a principal actor, but there could be other actors as well influencing Taliban not to take certain action against TTP. So how significant is that? How important or how much weight that carries on Taliban decision making?
I think it is a significant factor, and we've seen these changes take place within the Afghan Taliban's approach towards the TTP. Because before the last trilateral that took place in Kabul last year, I think it was August, if I'm not mistaken. Before that, all the trilateral meetings that took place between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China, you would always have a joint communique or statement coming out where the TTP, ETIM would be condemned, of course, in the realm of terrorism. And also then there would be talk of extending CPEC to Afghanistan. But the last trilateral that took place in Kabul, it was surprising because the Afghan Taliban refused to give a joint statement where they were not comfortable in mentioning the TTP or the ETIM or the extension of CPEC to Afghanistan. So I think that clearly shows that the Afghan Taliban unfortunately seem to have fallen into that, a vicious cycle of being the middleman or the middle player in the Indo-Pak rivalry. And I think this is very unfortunate because, on the contrary, Afghanistan could play an immense or rather a positive role in being the common ground between these two countries. But clearly, I feel that the current regime is again following into the footsteps of the previous rulers of Afghanistan by falling into this trap. However, again, here I will say that the current authorities in Afghanistan do call themselves the de facto authorities, and I feel that they are capable of making decisions on their own. And no matter how much influence is put on them, I think the decision at the end of the day is theirs. And the decision to support or not support the TTP is something that they are responsible for, and the onus is solely on them, no matter how much pressure or influence is there from outside.
Absolutely, because they are governing at this moment. So you use the term de facto Taliban regime. Do you see this as one unit working coherently, or there are factions which are competing for their influence within Afghanistan at this moment, which is making it difficult?
I think, look, at the end of the day, even if, of course, there are different factions within the Afghan Taliban, but I think the strength of the Afghan Taliban is the fact that even if they agree or they do not agree, or they adhere to the policies of the Emir, that is the strength of the group, that they have always stuck together and they follow his policies, even if they don't necessarily agree with them. Certainly, there are differences within the group. We have seen this, whether it's been on policy issues regarding, women's education or human rights, or even the appointment of certain governors within the country. But I think at the end of the day, no single, faction within the Taliban is strong enough to take over the other. That is why they are still operating as one unit under Mullah Akhundzada.
Okay, great. Now coming to the ongoing crisis in the region, where Afghanistan's neighbor Iran is directly involved in that conflict. Do you foresee the impact of this crisis on Afghanistan's stability? Where will it go? Or whether or not the de facto Taliban regime, as we call them, they might exploit this opportunity to create more instability in other parts, like in Pakistan. So how do you see that conflict influencing their decision making at this moment?
I mean, certainly that's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer because if the Afghan Taliban look at it in the larger spectrum of things, I think they shouldn't allow any other entity to, use this particular issue to cause harm towards Pakistan, because it will affect them as well. They have already been affected economically. Many refugees are coming back to Afghanistan. So I don't think it will be easy for them as well. But certainly, yes, there is a concern that it could open a two-front war for Pakistan, particularly in terms of further instability coming from Afghanistan and the Iranian border. But I hope that better sense will prevail within the Afghan Taliban to keep it solely bilateral and not allow further instability through its borders for Pakistan.
Great. We all hope for that. Now, coming to the economy, as we briefly alluded to that fact, how is it affecting Afghan economy and Pakistan's economy, the closure of trade routes between the two countries?
Well, I mean, look, I think the border communities have been affected severely. And I think it's important for me to highlight here that this is not a decision that Pakistan took in haste. Pakistan has shown strategic patience for a good 4.5, 5 years, I would say, where we have tried to use different modes of leverage, third party mediation, bilateral engagement to try and convince the Afghan Taliban to, honor its pledges of reform. Again, I stress on pledges of reform because this is something that they themselves agreed to. But it hasn't worked. And it's affecting, I think, both countries. I mean, from my estimates, I think Afghanistan suffers around 200 million, dollars because of the closure of the border. And I think Pakistan has suffered, and I think this is daily, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 177 because you're considering both the borders. So it's huge losses. But again, these are unofficial figures because the border is closed now. There is no trade, but it's damaging the economies of at least the border communities on both sides. Alternatives have been found, but of course it's devastating. And let me just tell you that post August 2021, when the Afghan Taliban initially did come into power, Pakistan was importing coal from Afghanistan, and bilateral trade increased in favor of Afghanistan tremendously, whereas Pakistan's transit trade to the Central Asian republics, I think, rose by about 70%. So there's huge potential there. But sadly, this potential isn't being realized because of the closure of the border. And let me just tell you one other point that we keep on talking about regional connectivity and these trade routes and these energy corridors. These cannot materialize until you have some semblance of stability between both Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Uzbeks keep on talking about regional connectivity and the Afghan rail route. But again, these are just myths in the air because unless and until you don't have stability between these two countries, how are we going to see these corridors actually functioning? So it's very unfortunate that it's affecting the economies of both countries. And what the Afghan Taliban secondly don't realize is that security and economy are intertwined. They're not isolated from one another. So I wish that they would be able to see this in the realm of, economic interdependence. But sadly, we're not seeing this kind of approach from Kabul side.
Yeah, sadly, I think because of the border closures, Afghanistan is facing, or the exports to Pakistan has been reduced to 10% of total Afghan exports, which happens. It has reduced, and from Pakistani side, it's only 0.6%. So it's Afghanistan which is losing more on this account.
Of course.
Yeah, but I've also heard, or the literature is available that Afghanistan's once they are exploring alternate routes for trade, they're moving their markets towards Central Asia. How do you see the future? Because this has a history, Afghan-Pakistan trade going on for so many years, and like you said, explained earlier, both people on both sides, they depend a lot on this. Now, if these trends continue to go to in a different trajectory, where Afghan traders they move towards Central Asian or other markets, so how will it impact in the long term the people in the border on both sides?
Look, there will always be alternate routes for both countries. But again, here I stress that for Afghanistan, Pakistan is the cheapest and the easiest route. And this is something that you just have to speak to the Afghan traders about, and they will tell you. It is the cheapest and the easiest route for them. And particularly now with the crisis in Iran, it becomes even more difficult for them. I know that the Indians tried the air freight corridor as well, where they were trying to tap into the Afghan market. But here, I think, it's unfortunate that the Afghan Taliban do not realize, the cost of this particular war with Pakistan. And I will call it a war because, it's no less what has happened. I think it's important to focus on economic interdependence because I've always seen that when there is economic interdependence, it reduces the chances of conflict. And we've seen this in so many cases before. This is something that I think the Afghan Taliban should work towards because Again, I will stress there are alternate routes, but they are more costly, they are more difficult, they are more time consuming. Pakistan, again, is the cheapest and easiest route. And that is why they have often spoken about, well, keep politics aside and let's have trade. But again, you can't have trade without having some semblance of workable ties. So again, here I will say that alternate routes exist, but certainly not the one that exists with Pakistan. For Pakistan as well, we will find alternate routes, but while we have this route, this has to be made functional. And this current situation is no longer sustainable, particularly when we're looking at the fuel crisis that we're witnessing because of what is happening in Iran.
Yeah, definitely. As Afghanistan is hurting itself, it is also hurting Pakistan's economy because, as you said, it's cheapest for Afghans. Likewise, getting access to Central Asian countries for Pakistan is also important. It's the shortest route. Finally, coming towards, in your opinion, what's the future like between the two countries?
Well, in an ideal world, I would have hoped that both countries come to some sort of
we live in a realist world, not the ideal.
Look, I think it's important. Okay, I'm going to be then a bit crude here. I think it's important to focus on the relationship as a relationship between two sovereign and independent countries. I think we need to move away from these terminologies as brotherhood and whatnot, because we, as you said, we have to be realists and live in this current time. I think it's important, two things. The Afghan Taliban, again, I will stress, they can't have the best of both worlds. If they want to be accepted as a responsible member of the international community, they have to adhere to certain norms and obligations, which, by the way, they themselves agreed to. Again, I stress on Doha. I know it's not very popular or convenient to talk about the Doha Agreement, but I think it's important because it's the basis. The only country that has largely benefited from the Doha Agreement have been the Afghan Taliban because they're in power and they haven't really delivered on those things that they had agreed on. Again, whether it's human rights, women's rights, whether it's an inclusive government, but I'm not going to get into that because that's more of a domestic issue. For me, it is more counterterrorism. And the Afghan Taliban can no longer rely behind this excuse that our CTA arrangement was only with the Americans. No, more, half of the international community was sitting there when this Doha agreement was signed. So they have to adhere to their counterterrorism assurances. Why? Because today they feel that by appeasing the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, they'll be able to win time. But believe me, it is a matter of time before the TTP turns against them. I think they need to realize that it's not just about their relationship with Pakistan, it's about two countries. And the economic or otherwise the interdependence between these two countries is unprecedented. We've seen refugees leaving Iran, but we haven't seen the kind of impact it has had by those refugees that have left Pakistan and gone to Afghanistan. All of them want to come back, because of the linkages they have, number one. So I think the Afghan Taliban should sincerely engage with Pakistan in negotiations and find a workable path forward. Number two, I think it's very important for both countries to enter into some sort of a strategic partnership, strategic framework agreement. Because if you see, both countries have no bilateral framework to engage through. Whenever there is an issue, unilateral actions are taken, whether it's the closure of the border or whatnot. If they have some sort of a bilateral framework that they can come back to, they will be able to hold each other accountable. And from my understanding, in the days of the Republic, a strategic partnership agreement was signed between the Republic and India, and it was also signed with Iran. And those still continue to exist today. So why not with Pakistan, where the relationship is so interdependent? And here I will say that I know it's a very unpopular premise that I'm going to put forward, but I think when we say Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, I think it's important for Pakistan to take ownership, and of course we have. But I also think that we, as a country, should maybe focus on finding pathways to negotiate with those elements of the TTP that are willing to engage in talks. I know it's not a very popular notion because of the kind of devastation that the TTP has caused. But remember, the TTP is not a monolith. It's an amalgamation of 26, 27 groups. And I think, we've done this in the past. Those groups that are willing to accept Pakistan's terms, Pakistan's sovereignty, constitution, and the writ of the state, I think this is something that Pakistan should consider because I personally feel that we shouldn't give so much leverage to the Afghan Taliban. I think we've already given them too much when they intervened and they did help bring about some sort of a ceasefire. But I think Pakistan is capable of solving its own issues, and I think dialogue should be at least part of the conversation, if not solution. So I think the onus is on both sides here.
And definitely, to reach to whatever everything that you said, there has to be some trust building, confidence building between two. So, final question: can the two countries get to that level by themselves, or you think that there has to be a push by a third country facilitated, like China wants to play that role? So, how important it is for China to mediate between the two countries, or they should let Pakistan and Afghanistan deal with these issues themselves?
I think, look, third party intervention or mediation or facilitation is always welcome. But I think at the end of the day, Pakistan and Afghanistan, they know each other more than any other. I think this relationship, again, both these countries know each other very well. And again, remember, it was Pakistan post August 2021 that was encouraging the international community to engage with the Afghan Taliban, including the Chinese. So I feel that both countries can do it on their own. They certainly need a push. And that push has to come from the international community in terms of holding the Afghan Taliban accountable. Because I feel that this issue has become bilateral, where the international community feels that this is an issue between Afghanistan and Pakistan and they have to solve it. But they don't realize that actually it's not just a bilateral issue. It is one country that is holding the other country accountable for an international obligation it made, which makes it more of an international issue. So therefore, the international community has to push through different means to ensure that the Afghan Taliban deliver on their terms of, the commitments that they have made. Bilaterally, both countries need to engage, but sadly, I feel that in the current situation, bilateral engagement has not been successful, again, because of one party's unwillingness to move forward on this critical issue. So I think there has to be more push regionally as well as from the international community, because I feel that the international community is more bogged down in, say, Ukraine or with China or sadly the side in Gaza or the Gulf crisis. And Afghanistan is, pushed to one side, but they, fail to understand that Afghanistan is a country that has always had global ramifications. And counterterrorism is not just a bilateral issue. It is something, it's an international obligation that the Afghan Taliban have to adhere to. And we've seen this. Look what happened in Russia with the ISKP attack. So the potential is still there. And let me also mention here the numerous United Nations Security Council reports that have spoken about the presence of terrorist entities. So this is something that I think the international community should play a role in. But at the end of the day, yes, it is an issue that can only be solved between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Definitely, I think we'll stop over here. I fully agree. The continued instability between the two countries directly affect their national security, both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And under the current international environment, we should not be looking for third-party mediation role. We'll have to come up with some solutions, some mechanism, some framework to at least build back these bridges, because geography is not going to change. So we are neighbors. We are going to remain neighbors. We have so much common in between the two countries. So it is in our interest to find solutions to these problems. Thank you very much, Dr. Amina Khan, Director, Center for Afghanistan, Middle East Affairs at the Islamabad Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for your time, valuable time. Thank you very much.